Waiter insulted old man in a luxury restaurant, not knowing he owns the restaurant. The dim lighting of Le Chateau Elite, the city's most exclusive fine dining restaurant, set the perfect stage for an evening of luxury. The air was thick with the aroma of truffle oil and aged wine, and the room hummed with quiet conversations among the city's elite. In the corner, however, sat an elderly man who stood out like a sore thumb. Wearing a worn-out coat and scuffed shoes, Henry Dawson sat at a table near the window. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his weathered hands clasped a menu as he quietly waited for a server. To the other diners, he seemed like an odd choice for such a posh establishment. But Henry didn't care. He was there for a reason. Enter Peter, a young, arrogant waiter who prided himself on catering to the wealthy and powerful. Spotting Henry, Peter's face twisted in disdain. He approached the table with a forced smile that barely concealed his contempt. "Sir," Peter said, his tone dripping with condescension, "are you sure you're in the right place? This isn't exactly the kind of restaurant for casual diners." Henry looked up calmly, his kind eyes meeting Peter's sneer. "I'd like to order, please," he said softly. Peter chuckled. "Well, let's not waste time. Are you sure you can afford anything on this menu?" Little did Peter know, the man he was mocking wasn't just another diner. He was the owner of the restaurant, and his lesson was about to be served. Henry Dawson wasn't just any elderly man wandering into a fine dining establishment. He was the visionary behind Le Chateau Elite. Decades ago, he had built the restaurant from the ground up, transforming a humble eatery into the city's crown jewel of luxury dining. Now semi-retired, Henry preferred to observe the business quietly, often blending in with the patrons to ensure his staff upheld the high standards he had set. But as the restaurant grew, so did the arrogance of some of its employees. Peter, the waiter now sneering at Henry, was a recent hire with a reputation for prioritizing wealthy clientele while dismissing anyone who didn't look the part. Henry had heard whispers of Peter's behavior, but this was the first time he had witnessed it firsthand. Peter's disdainful attitude continued as he stood by Henry's table, barely concealing his impatience. "Do you even know what foie gras is, sir?" Peter asked with a smirk, leaning on the table. Henry's calm demeanor didn't waver. "Yes, I do," he replied. "I'll take that along with a glass of your finest red wine." Peter raised an eyebrow. "Our finest wine? That's quite expensive," he said, his voice dripping with doubt. "Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something more, modest?" Henry's lips curled into a faint smile. "No, the finest will do." As Peter sauntered away to place the order, he couldn't help but mutter under his breath, "Why do they even let people like that in here?" Unbeknownst to Peter, another waiter overheard his comment. Maria, a senior staff member who had worked at Le Chateau Elite for years, frowned as she watched the interaction. She recognized Henry immediately and felt a pang of unease at how Peter had treated him. Maria decided to stay quiet for now, curious to see how Henry would handle the situation. Meanwhile, Henry observed everything with a quiet intensity. He wasn't angry, yet. Instead, he was disappointed. This restaurant was his legacy, a place meant to welcome all who appreciated fine dining, regardless of their appearance or background. If Peter represented what Le Chateau Elite had become, then Henry knew it was time to remind everyone of the values that had built the restaurant. When Peter returned with the wine and placed it on the table with an exaggerated flourish, Henry noticed the subtle sneer in his tone. "Here you go, sir. Enjoy." Henry took a sip of the wine, savoring the flavor. "It's excellent," he said simply, his tone polite but firm. "Thank you." Peter scoffed, still assuming Henry was just a clueless old man. He had no idea his condescension was setting the stage for a lesson he'd never forget. As Henry quietly enjoyed his meal, Peter couldn't help but keep glancing at the table. The sight of the elderly man dining alone in such an upscale setting seemed almost laughable to him. Meanwhile, other patrons noticed Peter's dismissive attitude, their own murmurs of disapproval filling the air. Henry, however, remained composed, observing everything with a discerning eye. Peter soon returned, placing the entree on the table with an air of indifference. "Your foie gras, sir," he said flatly. "Anything else? Or will that be all?" Henry looked up at him, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Actually, I'd like to know more about the chef's specialty tonight," he said politely. Peter rolled his eyes. "The chef's specialty is lobster thermidor, but honestly, it's a bit extravagant. Are you sure you want to go with that?" Maria, the senior staff member, overheard Peter's comment from across the room and decided she had seen enough. She approached the table with a warm smile and addressed Henry directly. "Good evening, sir. My name is Maria, and I'll be happy to assist you. The lobster thermidor is an excellent choice. It's one of our signature dishes." Henry smiled at Maria, appreciating her professionalism. "Thank you, Maria. I'd like to try it." Peter glared at Maria as she walked away to place the order. "Why are you wasting time on him?" he hissed under his breath. "He probably won't even tip." Maria shot him a sharp look. "You have no idea who you're talking to," she said quietly, before disappearing into the kitchen. As the evening progressed, Peter's behavior grew increasingly dismissive. He avoided Henry's table, focusing instead on the more obviously affluent patrons. Henry observed this with growing disappointment but said nothing, choosing instead to enjoy his meal and let the situation play out. Other diners, however, began to take notice. Some whispered among themselves, questioning why Peter was neglecting one table in particular. When Henry finished his meal, Maria returned with the dessert menu. "Would you like to try our signature soufflé, sir?" she asked kindly. "That sounds wonderful," Henry replied, his smile warm. "And could you also bring me the check?" Maria nodded and left to fulfill the order. Peter, noticing her attentiveness to Henry, muttered under his breath, "Such a waste of effort." When Maria brought the soufflé and the check to Henry's table, she also placed a pen beside it. Henry thanked her and quietly began to fill out a note on the back of the bill. Once he finished, he handed the check to Maria with a wink. "Please make sure the manager sees this," he said softly. Maria hesitated, curious about what Henry had written, but nodded. "Of course, sir." Moments later, chaos erupted in the kitchen as the restaurant's manager, Philip, rushed out holding the note. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Henry. Philip approached the table with a mixture of shock and reverence. "Mr. Dawson," he said, his voice filled with respect, "I had no idea you were here tonight." The room fell silent as diners turned to watch the exchange. Peter froze, his eyes wide as he realized who Henry truly was. "Mr. Dawson?" he stammered, his face pale. Henry stood slowly, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Yes, Philip," he replied. "I decided to pay a visit tonight unannounced." Philip glanced nervously at the crowd before addressing Henry. "I hope everything was to your satisfaction, sir." Henry's gaze shifted to Peter, who stood rooted to the spot, his expression a mixture of fear and embarrassment. "Most of it was," Henry said evenly. "But there's one thing I'd like to address." The room held its breath as Henry turned to face Peter directly. "This young man," he said, his voice steady but firm, "has treated me, and perhaps others, with blatant disrespect. He judged me by my appearance, made assumptions about my worth, and failed to provide the service that this restaurant prides itself on." Peter opened his mouth to respond, but Henry held up a hand. "I'm not finished," he said, his tone commanding. Henry turned to the diners. "This restaurant was built on the idea that everyone who walks through these doors deserves to feel valued, whether they're wearing a suit or a sweater. That principle is non-negotiable." The diners erupted into applause, their support for Henry's words loud and clear. Peter's face burned with shame as he looked around the room, realizing the gravity of his actions. Philip stepped forward, his expression serious. "Mr. Dawson, I assure you this behavior does not reflect our values. Peter, please gather your things. Your employment here is terminated, effective immediately." Peter's jaw dropped. "You're firing me. Over this?" "Yes," Philip replied firmly. "This restaurant has no room for prejudice or arrogance. You've not only disrespected a patron, but also tarnished our reputation." Henry watched as Peter hurriedly gathered his belongings and left the restaurant. His head hung low. Once he was gone, Henry turned to Maria and smiled warmly. "Thank you for your professionalism tonight," he said. "It didn't go unnoticed." Maria beamed, clearly touched by his acknowledgement. "It was my pleasure, Mr. Dawson." As the diners returned to their meals, Henry addressed Philip one last time. "I'd like to schedule a meeting with you and the staff," he said. "It's time we remind everyone what this restaurant truly stands for." "Absolutely, sir," Philip replied. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention." Henry nodded, his work for the evening complete. As he left the restaurant, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just a meal. It was a reminder that dignity and respect should always be at the heart of hospitality. The following day, Henry returned to Le Chateau Elite to hold the meeting he had arranged. The staff gathered in the main dining area, their usual morning routine replaced by an air of curiosity and tension. Peter's abrupt dismissal had been the talk of the restaurant, and everyone wondered what Henry, the elusive founder, would say. Henry stood at the front of the room, his posture relaxed, but his expression serious. Philip, the manager, stood beside him, visibly uneasy. Maria and the rest of the staff watched intently, eager to hear what their employer had to say. "Good morning," Henry began, his voice calm but commanding. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm Henry Dawson, the founder of this establishment. I built Le Chateau Elite not just as a business, but as a representation of my values: respect, dignity, and excellence in service." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Last night I experienced firsthand a failure to uphold those values. And let me be clear, it wasn't just one individual's actions that disappointed me. It was the culture that allowed such behavior to go unchecked." The room was silent as the weight of Henry's words settled over the staff. Even those who had never acted like Peter couldn't deny that they had seen or ignored similar instances. Henry gestured toward Maria. "I want to commend Maria for embodying the principles this restaurant was built on. Her professionalism and kindness were a reminder of what service should look like." Maria flushed, a mix of pride and humility on her face, as the staff broke into quiet applause. "But," Henry continued, "one person's efforts cannot outweigh the actions or inactions of others. Peter may be gone, but if we don't address the deeper issues within our team, another Peter will take his place." To drive his point home, Henry unveiled a new initiative: the Dawson Standard. This would be a comprehensive training program designed to reinforce the restaurant's core values. It included workshops on empathy, active listening, and bias awareness, as well as role-playing exercises to improve customer interactions. Every employee, from the waitstaff to the kitchen crew, would be required to participate. "Excellence isn't just about the food on the plate or the ambiance in the room," Henry said. "It's about how we treat every single person who walks through our doors. If you're not willing to embrace that, this isn't the place for you." One waiter raised his hand hesitantly. "Mr. Dawson, what if we've made mistakes in the past? Will we be judged for that?" Henry's expression softened. "We've all made mistakes," he said. "What matters is whether we're willing to learn from them. This program isn't about punishment. It's about growth. But make no mistake, going forward, there will be zero tolerance for discrimination or arrogance." As the meeting concluded, the staff dispersed, their expressions a mix of reflection and determination. Maria approached Henry, her gratitude evident. "Thank you for standing up for what's right," she said. "It means a lot." Henry smiled. "You stood up first. You reminded me why I built this place." Over the next few weeks, the Dawson Standard began to take effect. Employees initially resistant to the changes found themselves engaged by the training, their perspectives shifting as they learned from each other and from customers who shared their stories. The restaurant's atmosphere grew warmer, more inclusive, and customers noticed the difference. Meanwhile, word of Henry's actions spread beyond the restaurant's walls. Local news outlets picked up the story, praising Le Chateau Elite as a model of accountability and integrity. Patrons flocked to the restaurant, not just for its exceptional cuisine, but for its reputation as a place where everyone was treated with respect. One evening, a familiar face walked through the doors. Peter. Dressed casually, he looked nervous as he approached the host stand. Maria spotted him and hesitated, but decided to greet him. "Peter," she said cautiously, "what are you doing here?" Peter lowered his gaze. "I came to apologize," he said quietly. "I've spent the past few weeks thinking about what happened, and I realized how wrong I was. I let my arrogance blind me." Maria studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Wait here." Maria informed Henry, who was seated in his usual discreet corner of the restaurant. When she explained the situation, Henry's expression was unreadable. "Send him over," he said after a moment. When Peter approached, he looked nothing like the confident waiter he had been weeks earlier. "Mr. Dawson," he began, his voice trembling, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I was wrong, and I realize now how much damage I caused. I understand if you'll never forgive me, but I needed to say it." Henry regarded Peter for a long moment before speaking. "Apologies are a start," he said, "but change is what matters. What have you done to ensure you won't repeat your mistakes?" Peter explained that he had enrolled in a community program focused on empathy and cultural sensitivity. He had also taken up volunteer work, helping to serve meals at a local shelter. Henry nodded. "That's a good start," he said. "But remember, redemption is a process, not a destination. Keep learning." As Peter left the restaurant, he felt a small sense of relief. Henry's words hadn't absolved him, but they had given him hope. For Henry, the incident reaffirmed the importance of staying true to his values. The journey wasn't over, but the changes at Le Chateau Elite had proven that even the smallest actions could spark profound transformation. The transformation at Le Chateau Elite continued to gain momentum. The Dawson Standard training program became a cornerstone of the restaurant's operations, and its principles were soon adopted by other establishments in the city. Word spread that dining at Le Chateau Elite wasn't just about luxury, but also about inclusivity, respect, and impeccable service. Maria, now promoted to head server, became a shining example for the rest of the staff. Her professionalism and kindness were celebrated, and she was often sought out by customers who appreciated her genuine warmth. Henry, proud of the changes he had seen, decided to spend more time at the restaurant, often mingling with the staff and customers to ensure the values he had built the business on were being upheld. One evening, a couple entered the restaurant, their faces lighting up as they recognized Henry. They approached him hesitantly, their excitement barely contained. "Mr. Dawson," the man said, "we've read so much about what you've done here. It's inspiring. Your story reminded us that kindness and accountability can coexist." Henry smiled warmly. "Thank you," he said. "It's not just my story. It's the story of everyone here who chose to embrace change." Meanwhile, Peter's apology continued to weigh on Henry's mind. Though he hadn't offered forgiveness outright, he appreciated Peter's efforts to grow. A few weeks after their conversation, Henry decided to visit the shelter where Peter was volunteering. He watched from a distance as Peter served meals and interacted with the guests, his demeanor noticeably more humble and compassionate. When Peter noticed Henry, he froze momentarily before walking over. "Mr. Dawson," he said, surprised. "I didn't expect to see you here." Henry nodded. "I wanted to see how you were doing," he replied. "It seems like you're on the right path." Peter looked down, his voice soft. "I have a lot to make up for, but I'm trying." Henry placed a hand on Peter's shoulder. "That's all anyone can ask for. Keep going." Back at the restaurant, the staff gathered for a celebration. Business had reached record highs, and the team was thriving under the new culture of respect and accountability. Henry raised a glass to toast his employees. "This isn't just a victory for the restaurant," he said. "It's a victory for what's right. Every one of you contributed to making this place what it is today, a place where everyone is valued." As Henry reflected on the journey, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. What had started as a simple dinner had turned into a powerful lesson for everyone involved. The restaurant's legacy was no longer just about fine dining. It was about humanity. What would you do if you witnessed someone being treated unfairly in a public space? Would you step in or stay silent? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective.